We'll probably turn my own presentations on. We're going to do that. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. My name is Stephen Foster. I'm the head of creative studies. So welcome to UBC. Just like to take a moment to acknowledge that we're on the unceded territory, the Cedar Nation, traditional territory. I just thought, just to start this off, I'm just going to talk a little bit, and then I'm going to let Tanya do the introductions to the artists and other things. Just to kind of talk a little bit about the background of this summer intensive. It's been operating as an artist in residency, art intensive program for about 6 years now, in various forms. We try to bring in groups of artists for intensive activities. They get to connect with students. We run a number of courses alongside the residency. Some of you are in those courses. We try to mix that up every year, but we try to offer creative writing courses and then a couple of studio courses at first year level as well as upper year level. We also, I think this year, we've tried something new, and we brought in an art history and cultural studies course to combine with us. We also have some graduate courses as well going on. So that's kind of the student level of engagement you get. Hopefully you'll get to meet with each other through events and whatnot. And hopefully you get to connect with the artists as they come and go over the course of the month. We've been doing this, like I said, we've been doing this residency for the last 6 years. But before that, we really built the residency off of a program we called the Summer Institute for Indigenous Interdisciplinary Graduate Studies. And that was a graduate studies program only, but we ran it for a number of years, and where we had students doing 1 week modules sort of thing. But what we found out when we brought in artists, curators, scholars to work in these 1 week modules, they weren't really getting a chance to connect with each other. And that's one of the things we wanted to do when we moved to this kind of residency intensive model. So we wanted the participants, the instructors, or in that case it was instructors, but the participants, to get together and have an opportunity to exchange ideas and kind of focus in on discussions and debates in contemporary Indigenous art. So that's what we've got. So now we'll have a series of panel discussions and keynotes from our artists in residence and our scholars in residence, and I hope you enjoy that. I do want to kind of just make a note about all the work that goes into putting on these programs. We have, as I said, we have a number of courses. We have, so I'm just going to thank the instructors for their participation. So we have Matt Rader, who's doing a creative writing course. We have Catherine Pickering doing our first year studio, 137. And I don't see Alifa. Where's that? Oh, there you are. Oh, there. Alifa's doing our cult and art history course. And who else do we have? Oh, and we have Tanya, of course. I was going to get to you later, but Tanya, who's also doing one of our instructors. And I think that's it. Am I missing anybody for the courses? No, I think that's it. Also, I mean, there's a lot of coordination involved in organizing the participants. As well as the courses, and I just want to acknowledge the people that have been working doing that. So we have a number of people like Toby down here in front, who's been busy helping coordinate. We have Tracy Ross, who's assisting, and then we have Meg Yamamoto here with the camera, and she'll also be documenting a lot of the events, performances, and talks for our archives. Am I missing anybody else? I think staff. We have a number of staff. Those of you who are artists working in the residency, of course, will be familiar with them already. We have Simone Kessler, who's my admin assistant, but has been busy making sure all the checks get done and all that kind of stuff. Yes. We have Carla Whitten, who's also helping out in working with your welcoming packages, and she's put them together and done a really fine job with that. We also have some of our techs that are also participate quite heavily in the residency and work closely with the artists in developing projects. So we have Philip Winnis, who's one of our techs who deals with metal fabrication and a whole bunch of things. supports work around the gallery, that kind of thing, as well as we have Joanne Gervais, who does all the digital media stuff, digital printing stuff that some of the artists will be engaged in. And then we also have Jacob, I forgot his last name. Mitzler, who's brand new to us, so forgive me for that, who's also taken over a maternity leave for one of our other techs and works in the wood shop. So, with all those thank yous, thank you again, and we'll have to.
Over here. Oh, also
turn it on.
And I'm just waiting for the green light. Okay. White Esquest Tanya Willard, Slakat Laweka, Naskanlith, Nesopatmakutlu. I introduce myself in my language. It's an important part of my work back home and of cultural language resurgence and Indigenous acts of resurgence. Thank you, Stephen, for giving us some background. I think it's really important. I'm really grateful for this space that's been opened up here on campus through Stephen's work, through Ashok's work, through Peter Morin's work, many other artists who've been here in residency over the years. I've had a chance to participate as an artist, and in my new role now as assistant professor with the Faculty of Creative and Critical Studies, I'm very excited to have worked with all of you to be here today. So I also wanted to acknowledge, with also thinking about everyone who has contributed over the years to the space of this residency. I especially wanted to acknowledge and spend a moment thinking of the legacy of Greg Younging. Greg, who was here with the faculty at UBCO for a number of years, who I knew as a really pivotal and instrumental Indigenous thinker and maker and writer through his work with Thetis Books many years ago, and his work with Dr. Jeanette Armstrong, who's also here. We're lucky to have Dr. Jeanette also here on campus. She's a Syilx knowledge keeper, an elder, and professor. And Greg's work is really pivotal and instrumental, and I encourage you all to also seek out his most recent publication, the Indigenous Style Guide. I think essential for anyone working and writing about Indigenous issues, Indigenous contemporary art, Indigenous research and practice, and also for all of us working in any of the fields that we do, to have some sense of Indigenous Style Guide. And Style Guide refers to things you're familiar with in the academic sphere in terms of the Chicago Style Guide or the APA style or MLA style. And so I just really wanted to bring our attention to that work and that legacy of Greg. With that as well, and Stephen gave an acknowledgement here of Syilx land, and as someone from the Secwepemc Nation, a neighboring nation, I wanted to also offer my thanks for being here, and to also trouble the idea of land acknowledgement in some way. That I've been listening to a little bit of Hayden King's work, thinking about land acknowledgement, and while it's a very productive and generative thing that we're attempting to do to acknowledge territory, we also have to acknowledge that there's ongoing displacement and ongoing land rights issues in terms of this being unceded territories. And so I think part of what is interesting and is useful for me in thinking about how Hayden King has talked about land acknowledgement and his critical aspect of that is to think about what it compels us to do. And so as a neighboring nation, it compels me in my work to try to think more through Syilx philosophy, Syilx land, and to value those teachings in a way that's equivalent with some of the teachings we have in this academic space. And that's an ongoing process and ongoing work for all of us, especially in institutions with resources. So I also wanted to briefly talk about a couple events upcoming. I will be sending out some information about a number of events throughout July, and we do have artists joining us throughout July, which is very exciting. We have lots of great things happening, and that information will go out shortly. But before that, we have one of the artists who's joining us, a Syilx Nation artist, Sheldon Pierre-Louis. He has work in an exhibition opening at Penticton Art Gallery on Friday, July 5th. The opening's in the evening, around 5 p.m. So please, if you are attending and able to make it out to that Penticton Art Gallery opening, please do attend. Sheldon will join us periodically throughout the summer as a participating artist in residence. So Stephen did a number of thank yous already, but I will say that all of you, faculty, staff, graduate students other instructors have been essential in bringing us all together, as well as all of the visiting artists here today and here with us throughout July. So deeply thankful for this space for us to think and work together. And now I'm going to introduce Candice Hopkins, who's here with us for the keynote. You'll just have to excuse me, I'm going to read people's bios. Not because I don't know them and their contributions to the work, but because I think it's important to list their very incredible accomplishments. And I've had the privilege of knowing Candice for a number of years, and seeing her work as a curator, as a thinker, as a writer, really just, I don't want to say blossom, but really sort of ripple outward in terms of how your thinking has affected many of us working within the field of contemporary art and within the community of Indigenous contemporary art. So Candice Hopkins is a writer, a curator, and a citizen of Carcross Tigish First Nation. Her practice explores the intersections of history, contemporary art, and indigeneity. Hopkins is senior curator for the 2019 Toronto Biennale of Art and was part of the curatorial team of the Canadian Pavilion of the 58th Venice Biennale in 2019, featuring the work of the media art collective Isuma. She is co-creator of notable exhibitions, including Art for a New Understanding, Native Voices, 1950s to Now, the 2018 Site Santa Fe Biennale, Casa Tomada, Documenta 14 in Athens, which I believe she will talk about today, Greece and Kassel, Germany, Sakahan, International Indigenous Art, Close Encounters, The Next 500 Years, and the 2014 Sightlines Biennale, Unsettled Landscapes. Her writing is widely published, and recent essays and presentations include The Gilded Gaze, Wealth and Economies on the Colonial Frontier for the Documenta 14 reader, Outlawed Social Life for South as a State of Mind, and Sounding the Margins, a choir of minor voices at small projects, Tromsø, Norway. I don't know how to pronounce that. She has lectured internationally, including at the Wit to Wit, Tate Modern, Dakar Biennale, Artist Space, Tate Britain, Yale University, Cornell University, and the University of British Columbia. And she's also teaching with Ontario College of Art and Design. And I mentioned that because we have a number of students, along with Ashok Mather and Associate Professor Peter Morin with us as well, who are coming to join us in mid-July for the artist residency. We'll have a number of students from Ontario College of Art and Design with us and engaging in the residency together. So with that, I want to welcome Candice here and to guide us through some of her really incredible work. We're very thankful she can be with us and talk about her exceptional work.
Thanks, Tanya. I don't know why these introductions always make me feel so awkward, but I think it's also because it's coming from someone who I dearly respect so much, and I've learned so much from over the course of the years, so I always say this, but I mean it, very honored to be here with you, also on these lands, which it's been a number of years since I've been here, and as a way of reintroduction, I took an early morning walk around campus, and it was beautiful to eat some of the berries, which are flourishing at the moment, see where the bear had been, and talk to the ravens. So it made me miss my home, where I'm from in the Yukon, because even though we always called this the far, far south, there's some similar characteristics. So I wanted to take the opportunity to share with you 2 exhibitions that I've worked on. Some of the questions that were raised, I think, as part of working on the exhibitions, and then also their response, I think are important. So that's why I wanted to share them with you as well. And I also wanted to share them with you because I wanted to tell you some of the stories behind some of the works that were made by artists that I've had the privilege to work alongside. The first exhibition is Documenta 14, which took place in 2 different cities and 2 different countries, 2 very different cities. One is Athens, Greece, and the other is Kassel, Germany. And then the second exhibition, which I'll touch upon towards the end, is one that was initiated in a small town called Bentonville, Arkansas, which I never thought that I would travel to Arkansas in my lifetime, but there you go. It's home to a museum called Crystal Bridges. And Crystal Bridges is a relatively new museum for American art, and the reason that I wanted to speak about it was to speak about and to go into more depth as to the reception of both of these exhibitions, particularly with regards to Indigenous artists. So I'll start with Documenta. And it's okay if you've never heard of this show. It was an exhibition that started in 1955. It was an idea by a man named Arnold Bode, who was a resident of Kassel, and he remained a resident of Kassel his entire life. He was really inspired by a flower exhibition that was taking place in post-Second World War Germany. And when the flower exhibition came to Kassel, it attracted more than 200,000 people. So for him, he really saw this as evidence that perhaps art, at that time modern art, particularly art that had been banned under the Nazi regime, which at that time was called degenerate art under the Nazis, could have a place, as well as work coming from the new allies, so this included the United States. So he saw an exhibition as an opportunity to be a kind of city civic rebuilding effort within Kassel, as well as to show the relationships, the new relationships that Germany had formed with different countries. So a lot of times these major exhibitions come out of moments of trauma, in fact, and this is no exception. And now Documenta, as you can see, it's its 14th edition. The first 2 editions took place every 4 years, and now they take place every 5 years. And this last one, the 14th edition, and oftentimes exhibitions like to quantify themselves in numbers, attracted just over 1 million people, both when it was hosted in Athens and then when it was in Kassel. So right from the beginning, the exhibition had an interest in, I would say, a new internationalism for modern art. But for me, I think what was interesting is how exhibitions try to be a site of the production of knowledge. And in this case, how they can, in some cases, push back against what were, at that time, quite rigid standards of what art history was, as well as introduce new practices. So they undoubtedly produce knowledge, as well as learning and unlearning. And 5 years ago, 5 years before 2017, it was announced that the artistic director of Documenta, and his name is Adam Sumchuk, had made a rather unexpected choice for that edition. For the first time, and it had been making moves for at least 4 of the past editions, it was going to take place equally in 2 different cities. So that was Athens and Kassel. And this was out of an interest from the beginning in how this exhibition might act for Adam at least, and then for us who later joined as curators, kind of like a score, like a musical composition, let's say. So something that unfolds over time, something that you understand that is not fixed, and something that has many different players. You can understand us as organizers, as players. You can understand artists in a way, in a similar role. You can understand, in some cases, audiences as listeners of this score. So he was interested in creating an exhibition that would change and would reflect to each place where it was being shown. So it unfolded over time, and it included an ever-expanding number of participants, and this was artists, composers, writers, activists, community organizers, audience members, and so on and so on. Early on in the process, we spoke at length about whether groups of artworks could be ensembles. So think of an ensemble of players, of musicians. And that's how we can create the conditions for what we understood could potentially be a responsive exhibition. So a call and response between different artworks, if you will, rather than grouping them under fixed themes. And in this idea of a responsive exhibition, what we were thinking of is how, not the typical way where you install an exhibition and you kind of like wipe your hands of it and then you leave, and you kind of leave everyone else up to the work of interpreting it, of encountering it, of being with the artworks. Instead, we were thinking about not only how artworks themselves, but how even the context of an exhibition can be always kind of shifting and changing. And as we go deeper in, I'll explain more of how some of that took place. So from the beginning, because Kassel as a city has deeply identified itself with Documenta, Kassel is a small city right in the heart of Germany, right in the center, of just over 200,000 people, that has been really shaped by this exhibition. It's kind of funny because it was about 2 weeks before the opening, and I saw a mass exodus of senior citizens from the city. And I realized that what they were doing is they were trying to avoid all of the crowds, and I didn't blame them because I've been dealing with this probably since the 1950s. So this is a city that's shaped by an exhibition. It's also a city that calls itself, in German, Documenta Stadt, so it means Documenta City. So the idea that Adam had, which was to displace it, to bring it also to Athens, at first wasn't taken very positively, and that's to put it mildly. Also within mainstream media, also within what is called the HNA, which is a local newspaper that took itself very seriously as, from the beginning, in direct opposition to this move. But you have to understand that what was going on at the same time was what was called then an economic crisis in Europe, and much of the blame for this crisis was directed towards the South. So it was directed towards those countries who were called the pigs, and that is Portugal, Italy, Turkey, or Greece and Spain, sorry. And this is a very derogatory statement, as you can well understand. And so the fact that German money was going to fund something in Athens was also not taken very positively. However, what Adam was trying to, I think, provoke with this move was also an understanding that at the moment that the face of Europe was changing, and where it was changing the most and where there were the most urgencies was in the South. So directly following what was characterized as the economic crisis came people who were fleeing war, who were forced to leave their homelands, some of whom were economic migrants, refugees, and they were coming through Greece and other borders, and they were heading north, and a lot of them were heading towards Germany because Angela Merkel had said that Germany was going to accept as many refugees as they possibly could as a country. And because of the rise of right-wing nationalism and the neo-Nazi parties within Germany, this was also seen as a threat, not among just them, but among many others as well. And in fact, it started to shape a kind of new nationalism that was really rearing its head within Northern Europe. So some critics, and this is in the early days of this announcement, went so far as to characterize the move as a threat to German cultural heritage, absurdly insinuating that the event was being stolen by Greece, and that was insane to me. And the statement was even more loaded considering the crippling austerity measures that curtailed individual freedom in Greece and irreparably harmed democratic process there as well, due to the largely failed economic bailout measures that were orchestrated by Northern Europe, particularly by Germany and France. So at the time when I first started coming to Athens, To avoid mass bank failures, people weren't allowed to take out more than 50 euros from an ATM on any given day. And a lot of times the ATMs were closed. And this meant that people who had been working in public service for their entire lives lost their entire savings, they lost their entire pensions. And what was being promised from the north at the time was that Germany and France and the stronger economic forces that were part of the EU, the European Union, were going to bail them out. But what happened largely, and this is a kind of gross summary, is that what they ended up doing was using that bailout money to bail out bank loans that northern banks, and particularly Germany and France, had given to Greece and other southern parts of the European Union. So that meant that they were bailing out themselves. So individual Greek citizens didn't benefit from any of that. So just to give you a sense of the kind of political landscape we were entering in formulating this exhibition. So this was one of the first markers of the start of the double exhibition. These are banners that were hung in front of the Museum Fredericianum. And the Fredericianum is in fact the oldest public museum in Europe, and it was established as a public museum for art in the 1700s. One of the things that interested me as I started first as a curatorial advisor and then as one of the curators of Documenta, and there were many of us, there were 8, was the place of art histories that don't often get a platform within Europe. And one of these art histories and these practices are the practices of Indigenous artists. And this includes Indigenous artists who are also living, you could say, on the fringes of Europe. So in Nordic countries, including Finland, Sweden, Norway, as well as in the Americas. Because I think we can't understand the history of colonialism in the Americas as separate from the history of colonialism in Europe as well, right? So they're always deeply intertwined, and there's always been this kind of exchange. Someone who's had a deep influence on me, a Tuscarora scholar, Jolene Rickard, said that when she started doing work for a new exhibition at the National Museum of the American Indian at the Smithsonian, that's now in Washington, D.C., she said that she didn't realize until she started looking at their holdings how much gold that the Spanish took out of the Americas fueled the economy of the Renaissance. So these are deep entanglements that sometimes people don't want to acknowledge as entanglements. So whenever you try to create some kind of opening within broader art histories, people aren't always so receptive. I was interested in some of the critical reception that faced some of the artists that I included, and not everyone who I invited to be part of Documenta was Indigenous, but the majority were. And this was one of the first headlines from, she's not an art critic who writes very often about contemporary art. She is in fact, her training is in Renaissance art, and also for making a case for the need for monuments that were erected during the Third Reich to remain as memorials of this time. So this was her headline, but this was a changed headline. The first headline was called The Reindeer Dilemma. And then she changed it to something that I think is far more inflammatory. So given that in Germany, any kind of sign of nationalism is often taken as quite a deep threat, that she was conflating ideas of Indigenous sovereignty as making a case somehow for ethnic purity. So of course, when you're a writer, you want to get a lot of readers. And so this, I think, was, this headline ended up acting as clickbait. So we met in Athens, and this was published in the largest circulating newspaper, Süddeutsche Zeitung in Germany. And what was interesting to me later, and it took me a while to realize this, was how deeply threatened she was by the presence of artists who she didn't consider part of the European canon to even have a place within Documenta. This is the Google Translates. This isn't a great translation, but it was interesting, how complex the language she was using. So she was implying that as curators, we were somehow invaders. So she was conflating us with a lot of the histories that we were trying to critique, and which many of the artists were critiquing. But she also said, and this was kind of wild to me, this part here. Canadian Documenta curator Candice Hopkins says she considers it abusive when non-Indigenous artists use material from Indigenous peoples. So this was a bit of baiting that she did about this kind of recent use of a French artist using a headdress that was at a museum in New York, and I was trying to explain that you wouldn't dance around in the Pope's clothes. People would get a little bit upset by that. So why is it okay for someone to wear a headdress? But it kind of went over her head. And then she said, in the face of colonial raids, this may be understandable from the point of view of real Indians. So from the point of view of, and then she makes a distinction between real Indians and who she saw we were. So from the point of view of those internationally acting artists, so thereby, because you're internationally acting, you are no longer Indigenous, who do not define themselves by their origin, this is a barely acceptable restriction. So again, I want to make the case that, the only way that she could make this argument as well is to completely conflate the idea of cultural sovereignty with a kind of form of nationalism. And cultural sovereignty for me includes not just keeping of language, but in some cases the remaking of it. Customs and ceremony, and that also goes with ceremony, alive in the face of often genocidal colonial endeavors, as well as to fight against the colonial urge behind that often underpin national movements. Her argument went further. Not only was the inclusion of Indigenous artists who self-identified as Indigenous, which is indeed a marker as well of the decolonial process, a threat for her, but they didn't have a space, they didn't have a place within the European canon. Clearly what was missed is the ability to see these works as being about relations and about, in some cases, shared histories, no matter how problematic those histories are. And whether this is relations between culture, power, and economies and labor. But indeed, how many of these practices of artists we included acted as mirrors to the interests and desires of European society at certain moments in time. So I want to share with you some of the projects that we did, some of the artists that I was able to work with, and a little bit about why. So this is a work that has stayed with me, and I'm sure indeed with many of you for many years. I first knew about it because when I got my start in the late 90s at the Banff Center, this was a work that people were still talking about. So it's a giant megaphone made out of wood, veneered wood and hide, that was made for Rebecca Belmore, that then traveled across Canada. And in a way, she said that she made this work in response to Oka. And she made this in response to what took place at Oka, which was a kind of gross misunderstanding of the deep need to protect Indigenous territory in the face of kind of like stupid capitalist ideas, like the expanding of a golf course. So the mayor of the French town of Oka was trying to expand the golf course from 9 to 18 holes, and it was going to go over, of course, all of that land, but that land in particular, land of Conestoga people. So there was a standoff. And what happened in the standoff, I think, was exposing a lot of deep bias within Canadian society, mainstream Canadian society and media at the time. And so Rebecca saw it as an opportunity to speak back, not just to speak back to those in power, but in fact to have a device to speak to the land. So she came to Athens, and she came first with her sister Florine, and they walked the city for about 3 days. And after walking in the city in that time, it was a city of pretty deep unrest because people were in quite a traumatic situation, especially Greek people at that time, because of the loss of a lot of their homes and savings and things that they had, and I think a lot of people were fearing the loss of culture as well. And she said that what was needed from her perspective wasn't more sound, wasn't a megaphone, but was a place of retreat or a place of silence. And on one of the final days that she was in Athens, we went to the port of Piraeus, and this port has since been bought by a Chinese corporation to control a lot of international shipping lines there. And at that port, it was still one of the most visible places where refugees were living in tents. But at that port, there was an image of what to us looked like these colonial sailing ships, a massive, massive mural. And beneath the mural on the concrete pavement were hundreds of tents. And then behind them were massive cruise ships, because 80% of Greece's economy is driven by tourism and people spending time on the islands. And so, like she wanted to do, was to use this as an opportunity to work with local materials, so marble, work with a local sculptor and his team of predominantly female marble sculptors, which is a bit of a controversial thing, I guess, in Greece, because the practice of the sculpture is understood quite firmly to be in the domain of males, and Vangelis was really trying to change some of this perception within traditional Greek society, and to create a full-scale replica of a tent made from hand-carved marble. From the same mountain, it's actually the backside of the mountain where the original marbles came to create the Parthenon. And so Rebecca spent 3 days with Florine trying to find, in fact, the quietest place in the downtown city of Athens. And this is on top of Philippopoulou Hill, which is also known in English as the Hill of the Muses. And this is where the ancients gathered to convene. So this is an older site than the Acropolis, where the Parthenon is. And I have to tell you a little bit of a story about how we were able to do this sculpture. So anything that takes place on a site of archaeological importance within Greece, which is most of the country, let's face it, has to go through an archaeological commission, and they're called CAS. So the only way that we could get this in front of the archaeological commission was to send them a rendering. And the only way we felt like we could do that rendering was a kind of quick and dirty way, which was to install a tent on top of the hill, take photos of the tent where we wanted to install it, send those to CAS. And so we went up with a tent with myself, with Michelangelo, who was helping us, with a couple of other artists who had tagged along. And it ended up being extraordinarily windy that day. It was really hot, but really windy. So we started unfolding the tent and getting ready for the photo, and then we didn't even have the poles out when this guy comes running up the hill, and he's like, "You can't do this. You can't tent here." We said, "We know, we can't tent here." So we tried to explain what we were doing, and at that point, Michelangelo, who's Italian, his Greek was getting pretty good, so he's sort of explaining what this documenta thing is, and this guy's saying, "Well, in all of my 30 years working on top of this hill," and he's part of the archaeological commission, no one's been able to camp here. And we said, "We know, no one can camp here, but we're doing this thing, and the only way that we can get this approval is if we take a photo." And so there was a lot of back and forth, and then I think he started to be a little bit amused by this proposition, so he said, "Okay, I give you 20 minutes." And he left. So he looked at his clock, we looked at our watch, and we set it up as quickly as possible. We put Michelangelo inside so that it wouldn't blow away. We were trying to get photos without the tent leaning, all this, and we were sweating. He came back 15 minutes later, 5 minutes early, and we were packing up, and he seemed okay, but then he wanted to talk to us more. And he said, "Why are you really doing this?" And she said, "Well, I want to make this tent, and I want to carve it out of marble." And he said, okay. And he said, and then he looks at me and Rebecca and he says, and he points to us and he says, so you and you are Canadian? We said, yes, we are Canadian. That's one way of understanding it. And then he said, and you like to camp? And we said, yes. And he said, you want to put a tent here? We said, yes. And he said, okay. And so I asked him and I said, well, what do you think, you've worked for the Archaeological Commission for more than 30 years. What do you think our chances are of putting this marble tent like right here? And he was like, he thought for a minute. He was really thinking, and he said, I give you a 0% chance. So, indeed he was right. When we first presented this to the Archaeological Commission, they gave us a 0% chance. In fact, someone had leaked to the media that this proposal was coming forward, and one of the archaeologists on the committee said that it was going to look like visual pollution, which is pretty extreme. And the only way that we saved the project, in fact, was to do a kind of emergency trip by another artist collective named Post Commodity, and Cristobal Martinez, who was available to come to speak to Cass personally, not only about their project, which was taking place in Aristotle's Lyceum, but also to speak to this project. Because one of the other comments that was made to a journalist at the time was that their work, they kind of said from the side, that they said, well, what do Cherokees know about Aristotle anyway? And but the thing is, Cristobal has his PhD in rhetoric. And the basis of rhetoric is Plato and the Republic. It's Socrates. So indeed, he knew quite a bit about Greek philosophy. And when he presented to the commission at the end of that, they said okay to Post Commodities, and they just said yes to Rebecca's too. And they gave him cookies, and it was okay. And they agreed to this work. One of the biggest transformations that Rebecca wanted to make to the tent was to cover it with drapery. And part of this change happened because she was realizing the extent to which, at that time, a lot of the borders from southern countries who were part of the EU were closing. That meant that people were living in places that were only meant to be temporary, so tents, and they were becoming an increasingly permanent home. So a permanence was implied by this, but also a reference to the way that drapery had been used in Greek sculpture almost since time immemorial. Is that how people use the tent, in part? But it got the attention of someone else as well. So this image started circulating on far-right websites within Greece. And there was a threat within this and embedded within this text as well, that they were kind of goading each other to go to the tent and blow it up, in fact. And it was always accompanied by this image that was rather threatening of a guy's shadow kind of looming over the tent. And the reason that they wanted to blow it up is because they saw it, this kind of monument, and they had a good name for it. They called it the Monument to the Unnamed Refugee, kind of like the monument to the fallen soldier, the anonymous soldier. And the reason that they wanted to blow it up is because for them, it was memorializing a people who they did not consider to be citizens of the country. However, there were many other critiques of Documenta at the time, including this one, which originally was in Greek, and it was first, to my knowledge, spray painted right in front, or stenciled in front of the door of one of the offices. And I particularly liked the one that's on your right, which has the owl beheaded. And the owl is it's seen in many early examples of Greek symbology, and including on one of its first currencies. So one of the things that I think was a bit of a paradox for me was to be kind of lumped in, and I understand that I was also part of the problem of this exhibition that was funded largely by German money, coming to Greece. And at that time, Germany was really seen as a neo-colonial force within what was taking place in Greece. But what Rebecca wanted to do too was to make this tent mobile. So at the close of the exhibition in Athens, which took place for 100 days with a 23-day overlap, when the exhibition was in both places, both countries simultaneously. So for those who will go on to work on large-scale exhibitions, this is not a recommended way of working. Because that means that you had to have things not only on both countries, but in the mid-period, things kind of transitioning between two. So Rebecca's tent came by truck through Europe to Kassel, where it was installed on a hill looking exactly due south, directly towards Athens, so directly to where it had come from. But when you saw the tent in Athens, and I wanted to save this for final slide of this work, you saw this view. So you saw the Parthenon. The reason that you saw the Parthenon is because for many, this has become a symbol of the origins of democracy in European democracy or Western democracy. But for Rebecca, what was represented was the gap between where we are now, which for her was embodied in part by her sculpture, and the aspirations for democracy and citizenship that were put forward with the idea of the Parthenon. But there were deep contradictions in that too, because the Parthenon was built on a hill that was walled, and it also had economic segregation. So there was slavery also as well in that moment of the formation of Greek democracy. I won't be able to speak about all the projects because I realize I'm talking too long. But I wanted to talk about another one that I think was an opportunity to, again, kind of open up history, that wasn't even well known within the United States. And these are two weavings that I'll show you, and some documentation that for me is the beginning of a kind of larger thread of research, if you don't mind the pun, looking into the relationship between weaving, especially Indigenous practices of weaving, and the development of new technology, in this case, hardware. So in 1994, Mary Lou Schultz, who's an incredible Dene, or Navajo weaver, was commissioned by Intel Corporation to make a replica of a computer chip. And Intel was really a leader in the creation of microprocessors, and their main factory at the time was in Rio Rancho, which is just outside of Albuquerque, where I also happened to live. What I didn't know when I found out about this work was that this work was installed only 5 blocks from my house. And the first time I would be able to see it was when we finally got it delivered to us in Kassel. And then in 2008, the Nerman Museum in Kansas commissioned another weaving from her, which is another weaving of a chip. These colors are a little bit blown out on this slide, but the weavings themselves are really, really bright. And often the way that a Navajo weaver sees their craft, or sees who's superior in their craft, is the number of lines of thread, of wool, that you can have in a square inch. And so this means that Mary Lou's weavings are incredibly tight. But it also means that what she's doing is incredibly difficult, because Navajo weavings are made thread by thread. So it's not like you're making patches of these and then sewing them together afterwards, like Aztec weaving was done, but it's all a continual piece. So I just told you that story. But what was really interesting to me was the fact that Intel Corporation had commissioned this computer chip weaving from Mary Lou Schultz, but that the kind of corporation, or whatever that word would be, of Intel was in fact called Fairchild Industries. Fairchild Industries was a kind of brainchild of California, where Stanford University would later become, so it's sort of like the heart of the tech industry. And Fairchild was the maker of semiconductors and then later microprocessors. So they were making semiconductors, which were computer chips for NASA, for early satellites. And they had an idea, and my thinking is that they were trying to on one hand, take advantage of the cheap labor of brown women, but on the other hand, make their product distinctly American by opening up a plant on the Navajo Nation. And in their early advertising, they made a link between weaving and the aesthetics of computer chips, of early computer chips. And so their proposal to Navajo Nation, which was partially funded by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, was to work with Navajo women weavers, to employ them specifically. And one thing I wanted to note is that we often know the names and the faces of those who develop software. People like Mark Zuckerberg, of course, but we never know the names and the faces of the largely brown Asian women who construct our hardware, both in our phones and our computers. So this was really interesting advertising at the time. That was one making this kind of aesthetic affinity between the practice of weaving, as well as not just its aesthetics, but the kind of mental processes, and making this alignment with the manufacture of early computer chips. But knowing at that time there was a shift in kind of global manufacture, including in the United States, to look for ever cheaper sources of labor. So towards the end of the plant's closing, they were already starting to shift their operations to Asia. And this was despite the fact that their wages on Navajo Nation were already incredibly low, and they were subsidized by more than 50% by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But then this happened. The American Indian Movement, and in this case here in Shiprock, led by Dennis Banks, because there had been a kind of mass layoff of workers, over 100 workers, leading up to this moment, as well as what was felt as unfair labor practices. It was an inside job, so they took someone hostage who already knew in advance that they were going to be taken hostage by Banks and other people working with him, and they took over the plant. Because they wanted to call attention to the fact that they wanted kind of different working conditions, better pay, as well as all the jobs back. But what they didn't realize at the time was that these operations were already being slated to close. This made headlines around the world. So there were copies of this. There were many articles that were written in Gallup, which is a border town of Navajo Nation, as well as New York Times, as well as even in Europe. A lot of people kind of really talked about the fact that this was like this radical gesture, and it was a bit threatening. But one of my favorite articles of the era was talking about how Fairchild had racked up a massive phone bill because of all the negotiations that were taking place with the people on the inside. And the people on the inside, of course, said that they weren't going to pay it, so it was left to Fairchild to pay that bill. So I'm going to skip ahead in quite an extreme way, so forgive me for doing that because I've been rambling on too long. But I wanted to shift ahead to make a point. I wanted to shift ahead to make a point about another exhibition, the one that I mentioned at the beginning, Art for a New Understanding, Native Voices, 1950s till now, which I was brought in a little later in the process, about 2 years later. It was initiated by Manuela Well-Offman, who was then a curator at Crystal Bridges Museum, and then Mindy Bisa, who is now current curator at Crystal Bridges, and myself joined the team. Crystal Bridges characterizes itself as a museum of American art, but like many museums of American art, they don't tell a complete history of the development of American art. And I think that some places are trying to make strides to change this. One way that they try to do this, of course, is through the narrative that they're telling through their collections, through their permanent collections, so what's on permanent view. Another way that museums tend to do this as well is through temporary exhibitions, one of the last and final ways that change often happens is structural. So thinking about the makeup of staff, thinking about the makeup of boards, thinking about the makeup of who indeed funds the places tend to be larger questions that aren't always dealt with. So one of the points that I'm making, and as you see all this flash before your eyes, is that often we get the art history that we're ready for. So what I realized through the process of working with Documenta, with working alongside artists to make really extraordinary projects, some of those projects would go and have an impact back in their home country. One example is an incredible artist named Britta Marikatt-Lava, who saw me from Sápmi in northern Sweden, and she had been largely ignored in her home country until she showed her enormous weaving, which is or tapestry, which is 23 meters long, within the Documenta Halle, which is one of the main venues within Kassel. And it was only after that that she was starting to have major exhibitions in more mainstream museums. Most of her exhibition record up to that point was in fact in northern Norway, also in Sápmi or in Sami land. This exhibition, which is currently touring, was just at the Museum of Contemporary Native Arts in Santa Fe. It will soon go to the Nasher Museum, which is at Duke University, and it will end its tour at the Memphis Brooks Museum. Really, I think that Crystal Bridges was trying to make a case for using this exhibition as a way for other museums of American art to also take a deeper look at what was being represented and also not being represented within their collections. What was interesting to me is also the kind of response that this generated. This is a weaving by Melissa Cody, who's the niece of Mary Lou Schultz, on the cover of Art in America, and in an article by, he's a non-native scholar, but he's a great writer named Christopher Green. He was contrasting this exhibition with one that's currently on view at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and thinking about different strategies of what he was trying to propose, which might be beyond mere inclusion, which for us working in Canada, I think is a discourse that we know well. In the United States, I know a lot of museums are still really upheld when they don't simply call those early makers of some of our oldest cultural belongings so they're not couched in the terms of anthropology, but instead these makers are called artists. So for many American museums, this is like the most exciting development that they've seen. But for us, I think we're already well beyond this. So my question is how these exhibitions both can influence, you could call mainstream art histories, if that is indeed what they're trying to do, but also to expose the limits of tolerance. One of the limits of tolerance for this show was shown kind of early on, and I'll scroll through some images. Because when we were trying to get a tour for this show, we approached, some of the major institutions, including the Whitney Museum, the Walker, the Hammer. No one was interested in taking it. And instead, I think what they were interested in doing was, in some cases, trying to generate their own exhibitions. There are rumors that the Whitney's working on an exhibition of Indigenous and video art. But again, what is taking place over and over again in the United States is a lack of not only consultation with Native communities, this is starting to happen, but the idea that you also don't need Native curators to do these shows. That they can be done just based on research from curators who are already in-house. And as we know, this only goes so far. One of the things that I was really proud of, almost finished in working on this show, was this opportunity to show a different view of this quite famous piece, canonical piece by James Luna, artifact piece, that was performed more than once, where he placed himself in a vitrine. And what he told me early on was when people came to see him at the San Diego Museum of Man, which if you ever go to San Diego, maybe some of you have been to this museum, it's really a trip, because when you see it, you kind of feel like what a museum was like when it was really racist and it was, in 1888. It still feels like that. So he said that when he placed himself in this vitrine, and he said it took a lot of training, because he had to train himself to breathe differently so that his breath was almost imperceptible, and that it's also an act of extreme endurance. And you can see that people here are looking at him, but they're also reading the labels. And the labels weren't kind of usual museum labels that would say something authoritative about what you were looking at. They were, talking about some of his record collection, talking about a scar that he got when he got in a drunken argument with one of his family members. So they were all deeply personal. But the thing that shocked me is, and maybe it shouldn't have, but when he told me that people were not shocked to see a body in a museum. To them, this was kind of normal. They were only shocked when they realized that he was alive. And when I was talking to James, just leading up to his passing, which was really a surprise to all of us, I think, in the Native community, he also said that he had a lot of photographs, including some of these that had never been seen, but he also had the first sketches that he made when he was thinking through this performance, so we were able to show some of those as well. He also told me that no museum, despite how famous this work has become and how much of an example it is of culturally specific institutional critique, that no museum had ever approached him to buy these and include them in their collection. So here's some other examples of work. And this is perhaps a good one to end on. This is a series of mirror shields made by Chunupahanska Luker, and the video was done by Rory Wakemup. And this was done at Standing Rock, where Chunupa's from. And it was an intervention that was made so that those private security firms who were hired to protect the interests of the corporations who were using lethal force against water protectors could see themselves reflected in the mirrors, as well as police themselves. And by way of closing, I would say that exhibitions also challenge institutions. As part of the process of developing Art for a New Understanding, Crystal Bridges developed a land acknowledgement statement. And I know we've already been talking about land acknowledgements. This isn't a usual practice in the US. But this was also the first time that the museum had made any sort of concerted and long-term efforts to establish relationships with Caddo, Kapa, and Osage communities and peoples and nations and leaders. And now this address isn't just given in relation to Indigenous events, and it isn't just given in passing or performatively, as it's often done here in Canada, but it takes place at the opening of all exhibitions now. So I want to conclude simply that where I started, that is exhibitions produce knowledge, they also expose the limits of tolerance, and they also produce the knowledge and the art histories that certain audiences are willing to make space for. So thank you.